I think water can really bring a garden to life. But I have to say, there are more problems with water features, I think, than anything else in the garden. I've just got two very simple ones. And this whole video is about water features and how to remove the problems and talking to a specialist. So this is my very simplest of simplest, and it's purely a bowl I got on Etsy. And I did this because in my water butt it is full of bees and they're drowning, and so they're obviously, bees need water. I planted the perennial meadow. There's going to be lots more insects here, and so they want something to drink. Now, I haven't got any chemicals in this. It's just natural water. It's pebbles. It will evaporate. I'll top it up. It will go green. I'll have more moss on it, which I love because it makes it very easy for bees to drink low down in the water. And I think it looks quite nice. So it's a rustic area and this fits in nicely. Now I'm going to show you my other water feature. So this is my biggest water feature and it's very low maintenance. All I do to it is I might, every so often, once a year maximum, put in something called Aquabio. And that is actually a chemical that actually makes the sludge in the bottom, which can be very anaerobic and smelly and can build up. And that just helps it make it more aerobic, full of oxygen, and it's sweet smelling. And that's good because it stops it building up, and then you don't ever have to clear it out. So that's great. I sometimes rake the leaves off in the autumn because they can decompose and make all that smelly stuff as well. I will top it up regularly, so I've got a tap and a hose over there, and I'll do that maybe once a week in the hot summer. Otherwise, it's pretty maintenance free. It pulls in woodpeckers, ducks, insects, anything you can think of there. It's just a magnet and I love it. I wanted to pick an expert's brain on all the problems you potentially can have with water features. So I spoke to Mike Tillett of Till's Water Features. He's been creating and maintaining specialist water features, commercial and high-end private, for well over 20 years.
So many people are scared of water because they think it's going to go green, the pump's going to back up, they think it's going to be hard work, they'll be pulling out leaves. So can we just troubleshoot through all those things which people talk about?
Of course.
And you can tell us how we can avoid them. And shall we start off with green water? Algae in the pool, around, sticking to the bowl or whatever feature you have, and greening of the surfaces around it. So how do we stop this?
Yeah, I mean, just going back to what you just said very quickly, is I have phone calls all the time saying I've had a water feature, been fitted, and I've got issues. So these topics are coming up all the time, to be honest. Green water is obviously what nobody wants to have, the actual main body of water. Sometimes the sides of the water features or the ponds going green is absolutely fine. And I think that comes down to the nod of the design itself. So if you've got something like a pond, you want clear water, but if the sides go green, it's fine. Put aquatic plants in, it looks right. If you've got something that's more contemporary as a water feature, say made of stainless steel, or it's a concrete or a stone, it doesn't look right. So it's the design of the water feature that's important.
And you need to establish that, don't you, at the outside? Do you want crystal clear water and a very perfect job?
Exactly that.
Naturalistic. So that's a number one decision to make, which I think is
number one. Yeah. And
and
people don't actually understand that decision right at the beginning because they go off at a tangent, decide on the water feature, and then address the water quality, which it doesn't work. Inherently, it's the design itself.
I've made my lovely bowl, my formal water feature. I've got in pumps. And the water is moving, and that does make a big difference, doesn't it, when you have moving water as opposed to still?
Absolutely.
It creates oxygen in the water, is that right? Increases the oxygen?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the movement of the stagnant water. So things that would normally settle in the bottom of the pond, and then that basically starts to grow, and then you have dirty, smelly water in the bottom. By moving it round, you're not having anything sit in the bottom. So that's one thing. As well as just moving water, is oxygenating the water as well, because that increases the quality of the water. So if you've got things like ponds, aerating, waterfalls, fountains, things like that, as well as the moving, just a body of water, actually aerating itself. If you've got more contemporary water features like maybe a rill, or you've got just still water and you don't want any fountains and you want the substrate to stay clean, you need to be putting in chemicals to the water. It doesn't have to be a lot, but it just stops what they call biofilm. It stops the green on the surface going in.
Oasi are a well-known firm. They make lots of pumps, filters and things like that. But great thing they've got is the Oasi helpline. And you can ring that number during working hours. You'll get put through to an expert and they can help you with pretty much anything to do with water. So I find that a fantastic resource. Now, I asked Charlotte, who I managed to speak to that day, and said, what is the most common problem you have on your helpline? And she says it's the pumps stop delivering so much water. And that is because people put in their pumps, submersible pump usually, and they don't maintain it. And a pump will have an impeller in it, and it goes round and round and round, and it does get full of debris and it can block. And so you do need to regularly check your pump and impeller, maybe once every 2 months. But I think very few people do this. They usually just bang the pump into the pond, they tick in a load of chemicals, and then when it starts getting greener, they tip in more. And that itself is a problem. Probably the most simple water feature that people have, if it's not a natural pond like this, is something like a butt or a bowl, and it will have a fountain within it, a submersible fountain within the water. And that will have a filter within the submersible fountain. And they are brilliant. Oasi make lots of different pumps that will do this. But you will, in that case, probably not have plants in there. So you'll have the filter, you'll have the pump, and you may well have to add chemicals. Now, if you do add chemicals, you must understand that these small submersible pumps really are not compatible with high levels of chlorine. If you're going to use chlorine, you must only use very low dose rates, such as 1.5 to 2 parts per million of chlorine. Or better still, use an Oasi product that doesn't have any chlorine in it at all. And that will keep the water clean, along with the submersible pump and the filters, which are sort of consist of sponges and things in the water. Now, they are good, and they do need an electric supply. So you'll have electric to come through the wall of the water feature, and usually that's using a cable gland, so that allows the power to come in for the pump and the light. And then that pump sits in the bottom, and usually they're quite discreet and you cannot see them too much, especially if you've got a big water feature. So those are very simple features. Again, you need to clean them out regularly. Well, you need to clean out and check the pump regularly. And they are really good, and we've installed lots like that, and they look fantastic. If you want to go a bit more complicated, then you can have your chamber with water nearby, usually underground. So you have your bowl on top, and then you have a holding tank near it, under the ground, and the pump sits in the holding tank. That way you don't have any pump or filter within the bowl, so you really don't see it. More complicated because you've got to dig it out, but that is one step up really. And again, if you're not going to have plants and make it natural, you'll probably dose it with chemical, plus you'll have the pump and filter. I also spoke to another specialist I work with quite a bit, Nick Roberts, and he maintains and creates many stunning water features for big commercial schemes. And he says every week they have a man out that will go and net the pond, they'll vacuum it, will check the dosing in the water. And that is in addition to automatic filtration systems and dosing systems. So I think if you think a water feature can just be installed and left alone, that's really not going to happen. Most water features will need topping up, just about all of them, because of evaporation obviously, and in hot, sunny, windy weather it really does lose quite a bit. Now, if you don't have a tap nearby, you can have an automatic top up. Now, these are using solenoid valves, and on commercial features we often install them. But they do have wrinkles every so often. They're not fail safe, but they are generally employed a lot, and that is one thing you can do. But they're not cheap because you cannot top up from the mains, so you have to have a separate holding tank to hold the water that you top up from. Otherwise there's a risk that the pool water can contaminate the mains water. And Mike was very interesting about the sound of water.
It is difficult when you've got running water, you know, if it's too much, people want to go to the loo all the time.
Yeah.
So it's quite a balance getting it right. And I think when people first hear it, they find it disturbing and then they adapt to it. But I don't know how you advise on getting the sounds right with your water feature.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's an interesting one, sound, because I think the first thing a lot of people go for the aesthetic look of it. So you've got the material itself, and then you've got, the waterfall or the fountain. But the sound is quite, is an important factor. The way in which you control the water will make a difference. So if you've got, for instance, water running off, say, a disc, and it's just a small fountain and it's dribbling off, you're going to have that slight little delicate dribbling sound. If you've got a waterfall, the way in which the water comes out might be in small rivulets. You're going to have a nice dribbling, trickling sound. It's when you have a large body of water, big bore fountains, really high, that's when you get implosion. And that's where you get lots of sound. But you also get another subject to talk about is going to be splash, which is another problem. Another thing that I always find quite fascinating with sound as well is some people just ring me up and they say, I want a water feature, but I've got road noise nearby, and I want a water feature simply to drown out the road noise. So you're designing something with a big body of water, big fountains. That's what they want. You go and commission this water feature. You've got lots of fountains. They're a metre tall. They stand back. Can you hear the road? No. Big happy faces all round. 2 weeks later, we go back to take some pictures, and they've been turned down and they're only a few centimetres high. And it's like, why have you done that? The water feature is getting on my nerves more than what the road noise was. And it is quite incredible. And that happens all the time. I think what's an interesting perception, if somebody hasn't had a water feature before, is that you start to tune into it after a while. So when the water feature is first put in, you walk past the water feature, you hear the road and you hear the water, but then you start to always, as you come past, you pick up that sound in the water feature. You don't need it to be very loud anymore, so you can have small fountains, and I think that's something that needs to be considered more.
Right. I remember we were talking to a sound engineer, and he said he reckoned the best way to drown the sound out in the garden is to encourage lots of birds. And I think a pool of any sort will bring in far more birds than if you didn't. So that's another thing to consider. I don't want to do you out of a job, Mike. Birds are
I've got to get into
natural.
birds. Yeah, birds and water features. Okay.
Lovely. Splashing is a major thing. If the water feature's in a windy situation, if the bowl's quite small, the water from the fountain goes everywhere except in the bowl.
Yep.
Everything
Absolutely.
in between. What is a general rule of thumbs to prevent this? The general rule of thumb.
Okay. So if you've got fountains, the general rule of thumb is a fountain should be the height of it should be the radius of the pool. So if we had a pool,
the height of the fountain was a metre, the radius should be a metre.
A metre should be the radius, or the diameter should be 2 meters. I did a 2 meter diameter bowl. There's sort of the reason why they come up with that is that if you get that fountain that's a metre tall and you laid it on its side, it would basically still fit within the bowl. That's sort of why, as you rightly said, it's a rule of thumb. If you're in an open, windy condition, it makes a difference. As well, with fountains, if you've got something that's like a tall, more stable column of water, that's less likely to move. If you've got something that's more of a rose, small parts of water, if you like, they're going to drift and go outside so much more easily. So the type of fountain makes the difference. If you've got something that's like a mirror pool, obviously that negates splash as long as you've got the right way in which you're collecting the water around the outside. So
what do you mean by mirror pool? You've lost me there.
Right, okay. So a mirror pool, if you've got something which, like the specular we were talking about, our specular water feature, where you have no fountains and the water's just sitting and then spilling over a surface. So the specular does it, but you could have a rectangular pool or a round pool, for instance, and it's about the reflections, and you haven't got the splash, basically. All you're trying to do is catch it around the outside. Those sort of things, if you've got sandstone, porous stone around the outside of a water feature, that absorbs water, and then when it does that, it goes green. So you end up having to pressure wash it and use all sorts of things. And to be honest, after a period of time, you can't get it out of the stone anyway. You can seal stone, but as you've probably experienced in the past, we don't do any stonework, but it can blow the surface when the water is held underneath it, and then it starts to come off. So a good water feature design negates splash, and that's it. It's not insurmountable. You're going to have some go outside. We do internal water features, so you can imagine now you've got wooden floors and you've got carpets. You can't afford for anything, but obviously outside you can to some degree.
And with the stone, just to mention that, I mean, obviously stones have a hugely varying ability to absorb water. So if you're using perhaps something like a granite or a less porous stone, and that is worth checking out, and you can always check all the properties of stone. And when we were working on the hospital side, all the stone paving had to be very low absorbency because we didn't want algae, we didn't want people who were invalids slipping. So people don't realise that, but there are thousands of millions different types of stone, all with different properties. So it's choosing the right one.
Choosing the right stone. And another consideration with that as well is, so obviously non-absorbent stones, people use, like for instance in contemporary gardens, they might use porcelain stone even outside. Yes, it doesn't absorb, but what you also have to think about is that water's not absorbing, it's now laying on the surface, which can be a slip hazard. So at the same time, you do not really want water to go outside. It's not, we don't mind water going outside because we've got a non-absorbent stone. You can end up, as you rightly said, you mentioned about elderly, you don't want to have something where people are going to slip over. So I think I'm right in saying, Bunny, that you can get hold of stone that's got a different slip hazard. Even I think there's even
slip
British standards.
Slip coefficients and absorbency. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's what you check. Yeah.
Both of those together. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Water lighting has changed radically since the introduction of LED lights. They last for a long, long time. You can get maybe 30 years of use out of an LED light, so you don't need to replace anything, which is great. The other thing is they're quite small. You can get them in lovely little strips that you can run along the edge of water, so you hardly see them. You don't have these massive big lights that you used to have previously. So if you're going to light the water at night, and really that is the best time to see it, then look at the wonderful range of LED lights that you can get. Very few people decommission water features in the UK now, and if you've got running water, then it's very unlikely to freeze unless it gets really, really cold. So most people say you've gone to the trouble and expense of creating this fabulous water feature. Why would you turn it off and not have it running in the winter? So keep them running. And that will make sure, hopefully, it does not freeze unless you get seriously low temperatures. On my pool here, what I do if it looks like it's going to be cold, is I just put a football or something in there. And that means that when the ice freezes, we all know it expands and it can potentially crack the sides of a water feature. So if you put a ball in, then when the ice expands as it freezes, the actual ball takes up that pressure. The other thing is, because the wind's moving the ball around on the pool all the time, it's less likely to freeze because you've got water movement. So if it does freeze really heavily and you've got fish, then you would gently warm the surface so that the fish can get oxygen and they don't get trapped underneath in a load of noxious gases. But otherwise, just leave your water feature running and enjoy it. I've hoped you've found this really helpful. If you're designing a very big and complicated water feature and you really want to iron out all the wrinkles, then it is well worth bringing in a water specialist such as Mike Tillett from Till's Water Features or Nick Roberts.